My name is Evangeline Harper. I'm 29 years old, and yesterday at Cornerstone Community Church, my Aunt Delilah called me God's biggest mistake in front of the entire congregation. But what happened next changed everything. Picture this. Sunday morning service at our family's church in Millbrook Valley, packed with 300 people who've known me since I was 7 years old. The same people who've watched me struggle, stumble, and fail at everything I've ever tried. The same people who whisper behind cupped hands when I walk down the aisle in my thrift store dress while my cousins parade in designer outfits. Aunt Delilah stood up during testimony time, her voice carrying that syrupy sweet tone that always preceded her cruelest moments. "I just want to say," she announced, gripping the pew in front of her with manicured nails, "that we should all pray extra hard for my niece Evangeline. The poor dear has been struggling to find her place in God's plan." 300 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me sitting alone in the back corner. I felt my cheeks burn as she continued her public humiliation, disguised as Christian concern. Some people, Delilah's voice grew louder, more theatrical, are blessed with obvious gifts. My daughter Priscilla graduated summa cum laude from Riverside University. My son Jonathan just made partner at Henderson and Associates law firm. But Evangeline, she paused dramatically, letting the silence stretch like a blade. Well, sometimes I wonder if God makes mistakes. Maybe he ran out of blessings when he got to some people. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. A few people actually gasped. Even in our small town where gossip flows like communion wine, calling someone God's mistake in the middle of Sunday service was crossing a line that even Aunt Delilah had never crossed before. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the wooden pew and into the earth below, to evaporate like morning mist and never face another judgmental stare. Because in that moment, surrounded by the people who were supposed to be my spiritual family, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. But then, Pastor Jeremiah stood up from his chair behind the pulpit. Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield was a man who chose his words carefully. In 15 years of leading Cornerstone Community Church, I'd never seen him lose his composure. Never seen him deviate from his prepared sermon, never seen him publicly address family drama during service time. Until yesterday. "Delilah," Pastor Jeremiah said quietly, his deep voice somehow reaching every corner of the sanctuary despite its gentle tone, "I think there's something the congregation should know before we continue." The silence in that church became deafening. You could hear the old wooden beams settling, the faint hum of the air conditioning, someone's stomach growling 3 rows away. Aunt Delilah's confident smile began to falter as Pastor Jeremiah walked to the center of the altar, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "You see," he continued, his eyes sweeping across the congregation before landing directly on my aunt, "sometimes we judge people based on what we can see on the surface. We look at their clothes, their jobs, their living situations, and we think we understand their worth." I had no idea where this was going, but something in Pastor Jeremiah's tone made my heart start racing. There was something different in his voice, something protective, something that sounded almost like pride. "But God sees the heart," Pastor Jeremiah said, his voice growing stronger. "God sees the sacrifices people make in secret. God sees the generosity that happens when no one is watching. God sees the love that flows from hearts that others have dismissed." Aunt Delilah's face had gone pale. The congregation was hanging on every word, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but not knowing what. 3 months ago, Pastor Jeremiah announced, pulling a folded letter from his jacket pocket, this church received an anonymous donation, the largest single donation in Cornerstone Community Church's 70-year history. My breath caught in my throat. $10 million, and the words echoed off the vaulted ceiling like thunder. "For 3 months, Pastor Jeremiah continued, raising his hand for silence, I've honored the donor's request for anonymity. But yesterday, after witnessing what just happened here, I received permission to share the truth. He unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, his eyes finding mine across the crowded sanctuary. "The woman you just called God's mistake," Pastor Jeremiah said, his voice carrying a mixture of reverence and righteous anger, "is the reason this church will be able to serve our community for the next 50 years. What happened next was chaos. Beautiful, vindicating, life-changing chaos. But let me back up and tell you how a girl who grew up wearing hand-me-downs in the back pew of a small-town church came to secretly donate $10 million. Because that story will change everything you think you know about appearances, assumptions, and the mysterious ways that God works in the world. Trust me, you're not going to believe what I was really doing while my family thought I was just another failure taking up space in their perfect Christian legacy." What would you have done in that moment? When the person who spent years tearing you down suddenly realized they'd been wrong about everything? Tell me in the comments. But first, let me tell you how this all began. To understand what happened at Cornerstone Community Church yesterday, you need to know about Aunt Delilah Morrison. And trust me, knowing Delilah is like knowing a perfectly polished knife. Beautiful on the surface, deadly when she decides to cut. Delilah Morrison wasn't just my father's sister. In Millbrook Valley, she was royalty, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a single raised eyebrow, who organized every church fundraiser, every community event, every social gathering that mattered. If you wanted to be somebody in our small town, you needed Delilah's approval. And if you didn't have it, well, you became invisible. Or worse, you became her target. Delilah had perfected the art of destruction disguised as concern. She could tear you apart with a smile so sweet that bystanders would think she was being helpful. It was a skill she'd honed over decades, and she wielded it like a master craftsman. "Oh, bless her heart," was Delilah's signature phrase, and everyone in Millbrook Valley knew it was code for, "Let me tell you exactly why this person is a complete disappointment." When Delilah said, "bless her heart" about you, it was social death wrapped in Southern charm. She'd built an empire of influence from her position as head of the church women's ministry, president of the Millbrook Valley Historical Society, and chair of the annual Harvest Festival Committee. Her husband, Harold Morrison, owned Morrison Real Estate, the biggest property company in 3 counties. Her children were her crown jewels, polished and presented as proof of her superior parenting and divine favor. But here's the thing about Delilah that made her particularly dangerous. She genuinely believed she was doing God's work when she humiliated people. In her mind, pointing out others' failures was a form of spiritual guidance. She saw herself as a truth teller, a woman brave enough to say what everyone else was thinking. When she destroyed someone's confidence in front of the congregation, she believed she was helping them see their flaws so they could grow closer to the Lord. The scariest part? She was completely convinced of her own righteousness. I learned this the hard way when I was 16 and made the mistake of wearing a dress from the church's clothing donation box to Easter Sunday service. It was a beautiful dress, navy blue with tiny white flowers, but apparently it had belonged to Mrs. Patterson before she donated it. Delilah spotted it immediately. "Well, look at little Evangeline," she announced loudly enough for half the congregation to hear as we gathered for the Easter potluck. "Isn't that sweet? Wearing Mrs. Patterson's old dress like it's brand new." She smiled that razor-sharp smile and placed a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. "Bless her heart, she's making do with what she can get." Mrs. Patterson turned bright red. I wanted to disappear, but Delilah wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "there's no shame in accepting charity. The Lord provides for his children in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" She squeezed my shoulder just hard enough to hurt, even when some children require more providing than others. That was Delilah's gift, making charity feel like failure, making help feel like shame. She could take an act of kindness and twist it into evidence of your inadequacy. The worst part was how she convinced everyone, including herself, that this was love. "I am only trying to help the girl understand her place," she'd tell people later.
Someone needs to prepare her for the real world. Not everyone can be blessed with natural advantages. Natural advantages. That was Delilah's favorite phrase when talking about her own children versus everyone else's. Priscilla had natural advantages that led to her academic success. Jonathan had natural advantages that made him a gifted athlete and student leader. Their financial success, their social connections, their opportunities, all natural advantages that proved God's special favor. But me? I was evidence that God's blessings were finite and sometimes people just drew the short straw. She'd made the story so central to her identity as the family matriarch that she couldn't see me as anything else. In her mind, I wasn't Evangeline Harper, individual human being with my own story. I was the failure that made her children's successes shine brighter. The mistake that proved her parenting was superior. The evidence that God had blessed her family above others.
What Aunt Delilah didn't know was that I'd been building something extraordinary while she was busy building my reputation as the family disappointment, something that would shatter her carefully constructed narrative so completely that she'd never recover from the shock. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand just how deep her campaign against me really went. The Easter dress incident wasn't an isolated attack. It was part of a systematic campaign that Delilah had been waging against me for over a decade, with the precision of a military strategist and the persistence of a bloodhound. Every major family gathering became her stage, and I was always cast as the cautionary tale. At Christmas dinners, while Priscilla and Jonathan received envelopes thick with cash and expensive gifts wrapped in gleaming paper, I'd get a small box containing something practical, usually toiletries or generic clothing items that Delilah had clearly picked up at the discount store. But the real gift came with her presentation. Now, Evangeline, she'd announced to the entire extended family gathered around the Morrisons' massive dining room table, I got you something you can actually use. No point in fancy things when you're still figuring out your situation. She'd pat my hand condescendingly while my cousins unwrapped their new laptops, jewelry, and designer accessories. Practical gifts for practical people. The message was always clear. I wasn't the type of person who deserved beautiful things. During church potluck dinners, Delilah would systematically exclude me from conversations while making sure everyone noticed. She'd gather the younger women around her like a queen holding court, discussing their careers, relationships, and achievements, while I sat alone at the far end of the table, picking at my casserole in silence. "Oh, Evangeline," she'd call out loudly when someone inevitably asked where I worked or what I was doing with my life. "She's between opportunities right now, aren't you, Gear?" The way she said opportunities made it sound like a terminal illness. Still searching for her calling, some people just take longer to find their path. The other women would nod sympathetically while shooting me pitying glances. In Delilah's expertly crafted narrative, I wasn't unemployed or working odd jobs by choice. I was lost, confused, a spiritual and practical failure who needed their prayers and patience. But the annual church directory photo sessions where Delilah's cruelty reached artistic levels. Every fall, families would gather on the church steps for the directory photos that would hang in the fellowship hall for the entire year. The Morrison family portrait always took center stage, Delilah and Harold with their successful children radiating prosperity and divine favor. For years, I'd hover awkwardly at the edges of these family photos, never quite belonging but unable to avoid them entirely since I was technically family. Delilah would orchestrate the positioning with military precision. "Evangeline, why don't you stand over there?" she'd direct, pointing to a spot that was technically in the family photo but clearly separate from the main group. Perfect. That way, everyone's visible. The resulting photos told the story Delilah wanted to tell. The successful Morrison family with the struggling niece awkwardly attached like an afterthought. Those photos hung in the church fellowship hall for 12 months each year, a constant visual reminder of my place in the family hierarchy.
The youth ministry volunteer assignments were another battlefield where Delilah exercised her power over my reputation. When I'd volunteer to help with church activities, Delilah would always find ways to assign me to the least visible, least important tasks while giving the meaningful roles to others. While other women led Bible studies or organized mission trips, I'd be relegated to cleaning up after events or sorting donated clothes in the basement. Evangeline's so good with the behind-the-scenes work. She's not really comfortable with public speaking or leadership roles. Are you, dear? She'd smile at me expectantly, and I'd nod because contradicting Delilah in front of church leadership felt impossible. The truth was, I'd never been given the chance to discover whether I was comfortable with leadership. Delilah had decided my role for me and convinced everyone else that it was based on my natural limitations rather than her systematic exclusion. Even my living situation became ammunition in her campaign. When I rented a small studio apartment above Thompson's hardware store on Main Street, Delilah made sure everyone knew it was the best I could manage. At church women's ministry meetings, she'd casually mention my little place above the hardware store with just enough emphasis to make it sound tragic. "It's actually quite cozy," she'd say, with that practiced tone of someone trying to find the positive in a hopeless situation. Perfect for someone just starting out in life. The fact that I was 29 years old and had been starting out for over a decade was left hanging in the air like incense. When other women my age bought houses, got married, or achieved major life milestones, Delilah would make sure to contrast their success with my situation during casual conversations after Sunday service. "Did you hear that the Peterson girl just bought that beautiful house on Elm Street? Such a blessing when young people can establish themselves so well. Of course," she'd add with a meaningful glance in my direction, "not everyone's path looks the same. Some people need more time to find their footing." The devastating effectiveness of Delilah's campaign wasn't just in her individual attacks, it was in how she'd trained the entire community to see me through her lens.
After years of her commentary, people in Millbrook Valley genuinely believed they were being kind when they treated me like a charity case. Mrs. Henderson would slip me leftover baked goods after church, in case you need something for dinner. Mr. Williams would offer me odd jobs with the sympathetic tone of someone helping the less fortunate. The congregation had been conditioned to see me as an object of pity rather than a person with my own agency and dignity. And the worst part? I had started to believe their version of me. After a decade of being treated like the family failure, I'd begun to internalize Delilah's narrative. Maybe I was the mistake she claimed I was. Maybe God really had run out of blessings by the time he got to me. Maybe my struggles were evidence of some fundamental flaw in my character or worthiness. I'd stopped defending myself because what was the point? Every time I tried to explain my choices or share my perspective, Delilah would twist it into further evidence of my confusion or inability to accept reality. Silence became my survival strategy, even though it meant accepting her version of my story. But silence, I was about to discover, had given me something Delilah never expected. The freedom to build a life she couldn't see, couldn't control, and couldn't destroy with her carefully crafted public humiliations. While she'd been busy performing my failure for the entertainment of Millbrook Valley, I'd been quietly constructing something that would make her entire narrative collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. The question was, when the truth finally came out, would she be able to handle the discovery that everything she thought she knew about me was completely, devastatingly wrong? Let me paint you 3 pictures that will show you exactly how deep Delilah's campaign against me ran. These aren't just isolated incidents, they're calculated destructions, each one designed to cement my position as the family disappointment while elevating her children's status. The scholarship announcement disaster. 2 years ago, on a sweltering July morning, our church hosted the annual Millbrook Valley Community Scholarship Ceremony. 12 local high school graduates were receiving scholarships funded by various community organizations. It was always a big event, families packed into the sanctuary, local newspaper photographers snapping pictures, everyone celebrating the next generation's achievements.
Priscilla had been chosen to present the scholarships since she'd graduated summa cum laude from Riverside University and was now working as a pediatric nurse at Millbrook General. Delilah made sure everyone knew this wasn't just any presenter. This was her daughter, the success story, giving back to the community that had watched her flourish. What nobody knew was that I had anonymously funded 3 of those scholarships, $15,000 total, given through a lawyer in the neighboring city of Riverside to ensure complete confidentiality. The recipients were kids from struggling families, kids who reminded me of myself at 18, smart, determined, but without the financial resources to pursue their dreams. The ceremony was proceeding beautifully. Priscilla looked radiant in her emerald green dress, speaking eloquently about the importance of education and community support. Delilah sat in the front row, practically glowing with maternal pride, nodding along with every word, as if she'd written the speech herself. That's when things went sideways. I'd been sitting in my usual spot in the back corner, genuinely happy to watch these deserving kids receive opportunities that would change their lives. But when the photographer from the Millbrook Valley Gazette began taking pictures of the families, Delilah decided this was the perfect moment to publicly address my presence. "Evangeline," she called out loudly, turning in her front row seat to face me across the crowded sanctuary. "Come sit up here with the family, though I suppose this kind of academic achievement might be a bit overwhelming for you." The entire congregation turned to stare at me. The scholarship recipients' families, the church leadership, the newspaper photographer, everyone was suddenly watching me navigate this public humiliation disguised as family inclusion. "It's fine," I said quietly, staying in my seat. But Delilah wasn't finished. She stood up, smoothing her designer skirt, and addressed the room as if she were making an announcement at a board meeting. "You know, it's so wonderful to see young people pursuing higher education. My Priscilla graduated with highest honors, and my Jonathan is thriving at law school. Education is such a blessing." She paused dramatically, letting her gaze land on me. Of course, not everyone is called to the academic path. Some people find other ways to contribute. The room felt uncomfortably silent. Even the scholarship recipients looked embarrassed for me. The newspaper photographer, clearly sensing drama, started snapping pictures of the exchange. The next week's edition of the Millbrook Valley Gazette featured a prominent photo of Delilah standing in the church aisle, gesturing toward me with the caption, "Local family celebrates education and diverse paths to success." What made this moment particularly devastating was the knowledge that I had quietly contributed more to those students' futures than anyone else in that room. While Delilah publicly celebrated education and academic achievement, I had privately funded it. But her performance ensured that everyone would remember me as the family member who didn't belong at a celebration of scholarly success. 6 months later, during our church's annual food drive, Delilah orchestrated perhaps her most masterful public takedown yet.
The food bank preparation was always a huge community effort. Families would bring donations, volunteers would sort and package everything, and the distribution would happen over 3 days leading up to Thanksgiving. It was the kind of event that brought out the best in people, neighbors helping neighbors, communities coming together to ensure everyone had a holiday meal. I'd been volunteering at the food bank for 7 years, ever since I'd moved back to Millbrook Valley. Not just during the annual drive, but monthly throughout the year. I knew most of the regular families by name, understood their specific dietary restrictions, and had developed systems to ensure the most efficient distribution possible. But Delilah had a different role in mind for me. When she arrived that Tuesday morning to oversee the volunteer coordination, she found me in the church basement, organizing the canned goods into categories and preparing the distribution lists. I'd been there since 6 a.m., working quietly and efficiently to set up the system that would serve nearly 200 families over the next 3 days. "Oh, Evangeline," she announced loudly as other volunteers began arriving. "How wonderful that you're here early, though I think there might be some confusion about the volunteer assignments." She pulled out a clipboard with official-looking papers attached, holding it like a royal decree.
I've reorganized the volunteer schedule to make better use of everyone's skills, she continued, making sure her voice carried to every corner of the basement. Priscilla will be handling the family intake interviews, since she has experience with social services through her nursing work. Jonathan's fiancée, Rebecca, will manage the inventory tracking, since she has that accounting background. She turned to me with that practiced smile of false kindness. And Evangeline, I thought you'd be perfect for cleaning duties. You know, sweeping, trash collection, wiping down the tables after each family. Someone needs to keep things tidy, and you're so good with that kind of practical work. The other volunteers shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been working alongside me for years, started to protest. Actually, Evangeline has been running this operation beautifully. She knows all the families and has everything organized so efficiently. But Delilah cut her off with the authority of someone accustomed to having her decisions go unchallenged. I'm sure she's been helpful, Delilah said dismissively. But this year, we want to really professionalize our approach. People with relevant professional experience should handle the client-facing roles, while others can support in ways that match their capabilities. The word capabilities hung in the air like a slap. What Delilah didn't know was that I'd been anonymously funding the food bank's operations for 3 years. The new refrigeration units, the improved packaging supplies, the expanded hours that allowed them to serve more families, all of that had been made possible through my donations, channeled through the same lawyer who handled my scholarship contributions. I spent that Thanksgiving week emptying trash cans and mopping floors while watching other people manage the systems I'd helped build and fund. Every time I dumped another bag of garbage, I reminded myself that the quiet satisfaction of helping families in need was worth more than public recognition. But watching Delilah take credit for the improved professionalism of an operation I'd been supporting both financially and physically for years, that stung deeper than I'd expected. The wedding exclusion. The final concrete example happened just 8 months ago at my cousin Jonathan's wedding to Rebecca Sterling. It was the social event of the year in Millbrook Valley. Jonathan Morrison, the golden boy lawyer, marrying Rebecca Sterling, whose father owned Sterling Construction and whose mother chaired the hospital board. 2 prominent families joining forces in a celebration that would be talked about for years. The wedding was held at Riverside Country Club, with 200 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and a reception that reportedly cost more than most people's annual salaries. Delilah had spent months planning every detail, determined to showcase the Morrison family's prominence and success. I was invited, of course. Excluding immediate family would have caused gossip that even Delilah couldn't manage. But she made sure my inclusion felt like charity rather than genuine welcome. The seating arrangements told the story she wanted to tell. The Morrison family table, prominently positioned near the bridal party, seated 12 people. Harold and Delilah, Priscilla and her husband Marcus, Jonathan's college friends who'd become successful professionals, and several family friends who'd known the Morrison children since childhood. I was seated at table 11, wedged between the Sterling family's elderly relatives and Jonathan's co-workers from the law firm. Not family, not friends, just someone who needed to be accommodated but didn't quite fit anywhere. During the reception dinner, Delilah stood to give a toast that lasted nearly 10 minutes. She spoke eloquently about Jonathan's achievements, his character, his bright future with Rebecca. She thanked everyone who'd supported the family over the years, mentioning specific teachers, mentors, and family friends by name. The Morrison family has been blessed, she concluded, raising her champagne glass high, to have such a strong foundation of love, success, and community support. Here's to continuing that legacy for generations to come. The applause was thunderous. Everyone was smiling, moved by her words about family legacy and tradition. What made that toast particularly painful was realizing that in Delilah's vision of the Morrison family legacy, I simply didn't exist. Not as a contributor, not as a support system, not even as someone worth mentioning. I was present in the room, but absent from the narrative that defined who the Morrison family was and what they represented. But here's what Delilah didn't know about any of these three events.
The scholarship funding, the food bank operations, and even part of Jonathan's law school tuition had all been possible because of money that I'd quietly been earning and saving for years. Money that came from work I couldn't discuss, achievements I couldn't claim, and success I couldn't share. While she'd been constructing her public narrative about my failures, I'd been privately building something that would eventually make her version of reality crumble like sand. The question was, when the truth finally emerged, would she be able to accept that the family disappointment had actually been the family's most successful member all along? The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March, 3 weeks before the church incident that would change everything. I'd been sitting in my studio apartment above Thompson's hardware store, staring at my laptop screen and a stack of financial documents that represented 5 years of my life's work. The numbers were staggering, even to me, but the weight of carrying this secret alone had become unbearable, and I'd finally decided to try something I'd never attempted before, telling my family the truth. Not all of it. The legal restrictions around my work made complete disclosure impossible, but enough truth to maybe, finally, earn a place at their table that wasn't defined by pity or charity. I'd rehearsed the conversation a dozen times. I would tell them about my consulting business, about the clients I'd been working with, about the success I'd been quietly building while they thought I was struggling to find my purpose. I wouldn't mention the exact figures or the specific nature of my work, but I could at least give them a glimpse of who I really was beneath their assumptions. The Morrison family gathered for dinner every first Thursday of the month at Delilah and Harold's sprawling house on Magnolia Street. It was a tradition that had started when Jonathan and Priscilla were in college, a way to keep the family connected despite everyone's busy schedules. As the only unmarried, childless member of the family, I was expected to attend, but rarely included in the actual conversations. That Thursday, I arrived with a bottle of expensive wine and a carefully planned speech about wanting to share some exciting news about my career. I'd even dressed differently, a new navy blazer instead of my usual thrift store cardigan, professional makeup instead of my bare-faced norm. I wanted to look like someone whose success was worth celebrating. Delilah answered the door with her typical once-over assessment, taking in my appearance with the practiced eye of someone who'd been cataloging my inadequacies for years. "Well, don't you look different?" she said, the pause before different loaded with meaning. "Are you interviewing for something? Please tell me you're finally applying for real jobs." Before I could answer, she'd already turned away, calling over her shoulder as I followed her into the house. "Harold, look who's here early, and she's all dressed up like she's going somewhere important afterwards." The family dinner unfolded exactly as it always did. Harold dominated the conversation with stories about recent real estate deals. Priscilla shared updates about her patients and her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. Jonathan talked about cases at the law firm and his upcoming promotion to senior associate. I waited for my moment, growing more nervous with each passing minute. Finally, during a lull in the conversation as Delilah served her famous pecan pie, I gathered my courage. "Actually," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I felt, "I have some news I'd like to share with everyone." The table went quiet. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. "I know you've all been concerned about my career situation, and I wanted you to know that things have been going really well with my consulting work. Better than I could have imagined, actually." Delilah set down her coffee cup with the sharp clink of china against china. "Consulting?" she repeated, her tone making the word sound suspicious. "What kind of consulting?" "Business consulting," I said carefully. "I work with companies on strategic planning and operational efficiency. I've been building a client base over the past few years, and the business has grown significantly."
Significantly how? Harold asked bluntly. Harold Morrison didn't believe in sugarcoating, especially when it came to money. I took a deep breath. Significant enough that I'm considering expanding, maybe hiring some employees, getting a proper office space instead of working from home. It was a modest version of the truth, but it felt huge to me. I was finally sharing something real about my life, something that might change how they saw me. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Delilah started laughing, not a gentle chuckle or a surprised giggle, but the kind of sharp, dismissive laughter that cuts through skin and bone to reach your soul. "Oh, Evelina," she said, shaking her head as if I'd just told her I was planning to become an astronaut. "Oh, honey, that's really sweet that you're trying to make your little projects sound important." "They're not projects," I said quietly. "They're actual business contracts with actual companies." "Of course they are, dear, but consulting? Real consulting requires credentials, experience, professional networks. You can't just call yourself a consultant because you help small businesses organize their filing systems." Priscilla jumped in with what she probably thought was supportive commentary.
What Mom means is that consulting is usually done by people with MBAs or extensive corporate experience, she said gently. Maybe what you're doing is more like freelance administrative work. There's nothing wrong with that. Lots of people make decent money doing bookkeeping and office organization. It's not bookkeeping, I said, feeling my carefully planned composure beginning to crack. I work with Fortune 500 companies on major strategic initiatives. The silence returned, but this time it was filled with something worse than skepticism. It was pity. Jonathan cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Evangeline, I think what everyone's trying to say is that we want to be supportive, but we also don't want you to get your hopes up about something that might not be sustainable." "Sustainable?" I repeated. "Well," he continued, looking around the table for support, "consulting at that level is extremely competitive. The people who do that kind of work usually have connections from top-tier business schools, years of experience at major corporations, that sort of thing. Maybe you're working with smaller companies that call themselves Fortune 500, but..." He trailed off. But the implication was clear. I was either lying or deluded, and they were trying to let me down gently. Delilah leaned forward with that concerned expression she'd perfected over the years. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with false kindness, "we love that you're optimistic about your work. We really do. But family is about honesty. And sometimes being honest means helping each other see reality clearly." She reached across the table and patted my hand like she was comforting a child who'd just been told that Santa Claus wasn't real. The truth is, real consulting work, the kind that pays enough to hire employees and rent office space, requires qualifications that you just don't have. And that's okay. Not everyone needs to be a high-powered business consultant. There's dignity in all kinds of work. "But what you're describing," added Harold with his typical bluntness, "sounds like fantasy. And we care about you too much to let you build your life around fantasies." That's when something inside me finally snapped. "You want to know about reality?" I said, my voice rising higher than I had intended. "Here's reality. I made more money last year than all of your salaries combined. I own my apartment building, not just the studio above the hardware store. I've been anonymously funding half the charitable projects in this town while you've been telling everyone I'm a failure." The table erupted in shocked silence. "I funded Jonathan's bar exam prep course. I paid for Priscilla's nursing certification. I've been covering the shortfall in the church budget for 3 years so Pastor Jeremiah didn't have to cut programs." I was shaking now. Years of suppressed truth pouring out like water through a broken dam. "You want credentials? I have a master's degree in organizational psychology from Stanford University.
that I earned online while you all thought I was finding myself. You want professional networks? I have clients who trust me with decisions worth millions of dollars. Delilah's face had gone completely white. You want sustainability? I could retire tomorrow and live comfortably for the rest of my life on what I've saved. But instead, I keep working because I love what I do. And I keep giving money to this family and this community while you treat me like a charity case. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Finally, Delilah found her voice. She started, then stopped. Started again. That's quite a story, Evangeline. It's not a story. It's the truth. Well, she said, recovering some of her composure, if that's true, then why haven't you said anything before now? Why let us worry about you? Why live like... She gestured vaguely at my appearance. Like someone who's struggling? Because every time I tried to tell you anything real about my life, you turned it into evidence that I was confused or delusional or living in fantasy. Because you needed me to be the failure so badly that you couldn't see anything else. I stood up, my hand still shaking. And because I was stupid enough to think that if I just worked hard enough, if I just achieved enough, you'd eventually see me differently. But you don't want to see me differently. You want me to stay exactly where you put me. I walked toward the door, leaving my purse behind, leaving the expensive wine untouched, leaving the family that had never felt like family. At the threshold, I turned back one last time. The saddest part is that I would have shared all of this with you years ago if you'd ever once asked about my life because you cared, instead of asking so you could find new ways to fix me. I left them sitting at that perfect dining room table in that perfect house, surrounded by their perfect assumptions about who deserved success and who didn't. 3 weeks later, Delilah would call me God's mistake in front of the entire congregation. She had no idea she was about to learn exactly how wrong she'd been about everything. After I walked out of that family dinner 3 weeks ago, I didn't hear from the Morrisons for days. No phone calls, no text messages, no awkward encounters at the grocery store. It was as if my explosion of truth had created a vacuum of silence that nobody knew how to fill. But the silence gave me something I hadn't expected. Clarity.
For the first time in years, I could see my life without the distorting filter of their expectations and assumptions. And what I saw was extraordinary, even to me. Let me tell you what the Morrison family didn't know about my real life, what nobody in Millbrook Valley knew, because the nature of my work required absolute discretion, and the legal agreements I'd signed made discussing specifics impossible. It started 7 years ago, 6 months after I'd finished my online master's degree from Stanford. I was working at Murphy's Diner downtown, serving coffee and pie to truckers and local businessmen, when a man in an expensive suit sat down at my corner booth and ordered black coffee and apple pie. His name was David Chen, and he was a partner at Meridian Strategic Solutions, one of the most exclusive consulting firms in the country. What he was doing in Millbrook Valley was a mystery that would change my life forever. "You're Evangeline Harper," he said after finishing his pie. It wasn't a question. I nodded, confused and slightly alarmed that a stranger knew my name. "I've been looking for you," he continued, pulling out a tablet and showing me my Stanford transcript, my thesis on organizational psychology and behavioral change management, and several academic papers I'd published under a pseudonym. "Your thesis advisor, Dr. Martinez, recommended you for a very specific type of work that requires someone with your particular combination of academic background, analytical skills, and..." He paused.
choosing his words carefully, geographical invisibility. That's how I learned that some of the world's most successful companies pay enormous sums for consulting work that must remain completely confidential. Corporate restructuring that can't be traced back to external advisors. Merger and acquisition strategies that require absolute secrecy. Organizational behavior assessments for leadership teams who can't afford to have their weaknesses become public knowledge. My location in small-town Pennsylvania, combined with my advanced degree and my complete lack of connections to major business networks, made me the perfect invisible consultant. I could do the work without anyone in the corporate world knowing who I was or where the insights were coming from. Within 6 months, I was earning more per project than most people in Millbrook Valley made in a year. My first client was a telecommunications company preparing for a massive restructuring that would affect 50,000 employees. My job was to analyze their organizational culture, identify potential resistance points, and develop a change management strategy that would minimize disruption and maximize employee retention. I spent 3 months conducting remote interviews, analyzing survey data, and building behavioral models that predicted how different employee segments would respond to various restructuring scenarios. My final report was 847 pages long and included specific recommendations that saved the company an estimated $200 million in productivity losses and retention costs. My fee for that project was $1.2 million. The telecommunications company was so impressed with my work that they recommended me to their parent corporation, which led to a contract with a pharmaceutical giant developing a new drug distribution strategy. That project paid $1.8 million and opened doors to the healthcare consulting sector. Within 2 years, I was working with Fortune 100 companies on projects worth billions of dollars. Merger analyses for tech companies, cultural integration strategies for international acquisitions, organizational behavior predictions for companies launching in new markets. The work was intellectually challenging in ways I'd never imagined. I was solving puzzles that involved human psychology, market dynamics, regulatory environments, and corporate politics all simultaneously. Every project was different. Every solution had to be customized, and the stakes were always enormous. But the secrecy requirements were absolute. Every contract included non-disclosure agreements that made discussing my work legally impossible. I couldn't tell anyone what companies I worked with, what projects I completed, or even what industry sectors I specialized in. The consulting firm that connected me with clients maintained complete anonymity. My reports were submitted through encrypted channels, my payments came through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, and my clients knew me only by a code number. To the outside world, I was invisible. To my family, I was unemployed. To the companies that paid me millions of dollars for my expertise, I was consultant 847 Alpha, the mysterious analyst whose recommendations consistently saved them more money than they paid in fees. As my reputation grew within this hidden network of corporate consulting, my fees increased accordingly. By my 4th year, I was earning between $8 and $12 million annually. By my 6th year, I was being recruited for projects that paid more than some small country's entire GDP. The pharmaceutical merger I worked on last year, my analysis prevented a cultural integration disaster that could have cost the combined company $40 billion in productivity losses and retention costs. My fee for that 6-month project was $14 million. The technology company reorganization I completed 8 months ago, my behavioral prediction models identified exactly which management changes would increase employee satisfaction while improving operational efficiency. The resulting productivity improvements generated an estimated $600 million in additional revenue. My consulting fee was $8 million. But the money, incredible as it wasn't the most satisfying part of the work. What drove me was the intellectual challenge of solving problems that most people couldn't even comprehend. Understanding how organizational psychology intersects with market forces, predicting how cultural changes will affect financial performance, designing change management strategies that account for everything from regulatory compliance to employee emotional responses. I was working at the highest levels of corporate strategy, influencing decisions that affected millions of people and billions of dollars, all while living in a studio apartment above a hardware store in a town where people thought I was serving tables and struggling to find my purpose. The isolation was brutal, but it was also liberating.
While Delilah was performing my failure for the entertainment of Millbrook Valley, I was quietly building a financial empire that dwarfed the Morrison family's entire net worth. While my cousins were celebrating their professional achievements at family dinners, I was solving problems that their entire careers combined couldn't touch. And while the congregation was praying for my success and stability, I was anonymously funding their church's operations, their community programs, and their children's futures. The $10 million donation to Cornerstone Community Church wasn't charity, it was investment. Investment in the community that had raised me, even if that community had never understood who I really was. I'd structured the donation through the same network of legal entities that handled my consulting payments, ensuring complete anonymity while providing the church with enough funding to expand their programs and serve the community for decades. The scholarship fund, the food bank operations, the youth ministry programs, the building renovations, all of it was possible because of money I'd earned solving problems for companies whose names would be recognizable to anyone who followed business news. But here's what made the isolation bearable: knowing that my invisible success was creating visible opportunities for others. Every scholarship recipient who got to attend college because of my anonymous funding was proof that the work meant something beyond the money. Every family that received food bank assistance funded by my donations was validation that success could be used to lift others up. Every church program that continued operating because of my financial support was evidence that invisible generosity could have visible impact. For 7 years, I'd been living two completely separate lives. The public life, where I was Evangeline Harper, the struggling family disappointment who needed prayers and patience, and the private life, where I was one of the most successful strategic consultants in the world, trusted by billion-dollar corporations with their most sensitive and complex challenges. The question that haunted me wasn't whether I could continue maintaining this double life indefinitely. I could, and quite comfortably. The question was whether I wanted to. 3 weeks ago, at that disastrous family dinner, I'd gotten my answer. Watching Delilah dismiss my modest attempt to share my success, seeing my family's inability to imagine me as anything other than their designated failure, I realized that their version of me had become a prison I'd been voluntarily occupying. That's why when Delilah called me God's mistake in front of the entire congregation yesterday morning, I wasn't devastated. I was finally ready to let the truth set me free. The only question was, would Millbrook Valley be ready for the truth about who Evangeline Harper really was? Yesterday morning started like any other Sunday in Millbrook Valley. I woke up in my studio apartment at 6:47 a.m. to the sound of Thompson's delivery truck rumbling to life in the alley below. The autumn air was crisp with that particular clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. Later, I would realize that the universe was preparing me for a day when everything would finally come to perfect, devastating focus. I had no intention of creating a scene at church. After 3 weeks of radio silence from the Morrison family following my explosive revelation at their dinner table, I'd actually been looking forward to a peaceful Sunday service, a chance to sit in my back corner pew, listen to Pastor Jeremiah's sermon about grace and forgiveness, and continue processing the emotional upheaval of finally telling my family the truth about my life. But
I should have known that Delilah Morrison doesn't allow loose threads in her carefully woven narrative to remain untied for long. The first sign that something was different came when I arrived at Cornerstone Community Church 15 minutes before the 10 a.m. service. Usually, I could slip into my back corner seat without much notice. The congregation had grown accustomed to my quiet presence over the years, and most people offered polite nods or brief smiles before turning their attention to more interesting matters. Yesterday was different. As I walked through the sanctuary doors, conversations seemed to pause mid-sentence. Mrs. Henderson, who typically greeted everyone with enthusiastic warmth, gave me a strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. The Patterson family, usually eager to chat about their grandson's achievements at State University, suddenly became very interested in their bulletins. It didn't take long to figure out why. Delilah had been busy during our 3 weeks of family silence. I could see her near the front of the church, surrounded by her usual circle of influence: the women's ministry leadership, the church board members' wives, the social coordinators who managed everything from potluck dinners to holiday decorations. She was speaking in that low, confidential tone that somehow carried just far enough for nearby listeners to catch fragments of concern and disappointment. As I made my way toward my usual seat, I caught pieces of the narrative she'd been crafting. Poor dear has been struggling with some delusions lately. Family dinner was quite concerning. Sometimes people create elaborate fantasies when reality becomes too difficult. I understood immediately what had happened. My explosion of truth at the Morrison family dinner table hadn't convinced them that I was successful. It had convinced them that I was having some kind of mental breakdown. Delilah had spent 3 weeks transforming my revelations about Stanford degrees and million-dollar consulting fees into evidence of mental instability rather than hidden achievement. It was, I had to admit, a masterful strategic response. Instead of grappling with the possibility that they'd been wrong about me for years, the Morrison family had chosen to believe that I was delusional. It was easier to assume I was living in a fantasy world than to accept that their entire understanding of our family dynamics had been built on false assumptions. And Delilah, being Delilah, had turned my personal crisis into a community concern.
As I settled into my back pew, I could feel the weight of sympathetic stares and worried whispers. The congregation wasn't looking at me with their usual mixture of polite disinterest and mild pity. They were looking at me with the careful concern reserved for people who might be having mental health struggles. Delilah had successfully reframed my story before I'd even had a chance to tell it myself. Pastor Jeremiah began the service with his usual warmth and dignity, apparently unaware of the undercurrents of drama swirling through his congregation. The opening hymns, the prayer requests, the scripture reading, everything proceeded normally, while I sat in my corner, processing the realization that my family had chosen to pathologize my success rather than celebrate it. It was during the announcements portion of the service that I began to understand just how thoroughly Delilah had prepared for this moment. Before we move into our sermon this morning, Pastor Jeremiah said, adjusting his reading glasses, I want to remind everyone about our ongoing prayer requests. We continue to lift up the Henderson family as they navigate James's cancer treatment. We're grateful for the successful recovery of little Sarah Patterson's surgery last week. He paused, consulting his notes, and I felt a familiar chill of anticipation. And I want to ask for special prayers for one of our longtime members who's been going through a particularly challenging time lately. He continued, his tone becoming more serious. Sometimes our brothers and sisters in Christ face struggles that aren't visible on the surface, and it's our responsibility as a church family to surround them with love and support. The congregation murmured agreement, nodding along with the sentiment. But I could see Delilah in the front row, sitting straighter in her pew, preparing for something. Which brings me to a situation that's been brought to my attention. Pastor Jeremiah said, his tone becoming more serious. Sometimes people we care about begin to struggle with distinguishing between hopes and reality, between dreams and actual circumstances. When this happens, it's important for the community to respond with both compassion and truth.
My stomach dropped. Whatever Delilah had told Pastor Jeremiah about my delusions, it had been convincing enough that he was prepared to address it publicly during the service. He's asked me to speak with someone in our congregation who may be experiencing some confusion about their life circumstances. It's never easy to watch someone we love struggle with accepting reality, but sometimes loving intervention is necessary. The sanctuary had gone completely quiet. 300 people holding their breath, waiting to see who would be called out for this public spiritual intervention. That's when testimony time began, and Delilah arose from her front row seat like a queen ascending to her throne. "Pastor Jeremiah," she said, her voice carrying that perfect blend of concern and authority that had made her Millbrook Valley's unofficial arbiter of community standards, "if I may, I'd like to address this situation directly." Pastor Jeremiah nodded, stepping aside to give her the floor. "As some of you know," Delilah began, turning to face the congregation with the practiced poise of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "my niece Evangeline has been going through a very difficult period in her life." 300 pairs of eyes turned toward my corner of the sanctuary. I felt like an insect pinned to a display board, exposed and helpless under the weight of their collective scrutiny. 3 weeks ago, during a family dinner, Evangeline shared some very concerning claims about her life and career. Claims that, frankly, seemed to indicate she might be struggling with distinguishing between fantasy and reality. She paused, dramatically letting the implications settle over the congregation like fog. Now, I want to be clear that we love Evangeline dearly. She's family, and family stands by each other through all of life's challenges. But sometimes love means being willing to speak difficult truths, even when those truths might be painful to hear. I could feel my heart racing, but something else was happening too. For the first time in my adult life, I was not afraid of Delilah's public performance. 3 weeks of processing my family's rejection had given me something I'd never possessed before: the absolute certainty that their opinion of me no longer mattered. "The truth is," Delilah said, her voice growing stronger, more confident in her narrative, "Evangeline has been struggling to find her place in the world for many years now. And I think that struggle has become so painful that she's begun to create elaborate stories about success and achievement that simply don't align with reality." She paused again, her timing perfect for maximum impact. "And the truth is that Evangeline has been struggling financially and professionally for years. She works odd jobs, lives in a small apartment, and despite our family's efforts to help and support her, she seems unable to build the kind of stable, successful life that would make these fantasies unnecessary." I watched this performance with something approaching admiration. Delilah had taken every piece of truth I'd shared with my family and twisted it into evidence of psychological instability. My Stanford degree became a fantasy. My consulting work became delusion. My financial success became elaborate wish fulfillment. It was character assassination disguised as intervention, public humiliation wrapped in the language of loving concern. "Which brings me to today's very difficult conversation," Delilah said, building toward her climax. "Because sometimes love means being willing to speak truth even when it hurts. Sometimes love means refusing to enable someone's retreat from reality, even when that reality is painful." She looked directly at me, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who believed she was about to deliver the final, devastating blow. "And sometimes," she said, her voice rising to carry to every corner of the sanctuary, "love means being willing to say what everyone else is thinking, but nobody wants to voice." The pause that followed felt eternal. "Look at Claire, still a nobody," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Some people are blessed with obvious gifts, but Evangeline, well, sometimes I wonder if God makes mistakes. Maybe he ran out of blessings when he got to some people." The congregation gasped. Even in a community where Delilah's sharp tongue was legendary,
calling someone God's mistake during Sunday service crossed a line that nobody had expected her to cross. But I wasn't devastated. I wasn't humiliated. I wasn't even surprised. I was ready. Because 3 weeks earlier, I'd made a phone call to Pastor Jeremiah, a conversation that Delilah knew nothing about, a conversation that was about to change everything she thought she knew about power, truth, and the mysterious ways that God works in the world. The silence that followed Delilah's "God's mistake" pronouncement was so absolute that I could hear the old church building settling around us. 300 people frozen in their pews, shocked by the cruelty they'd just witnessed, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented public attack disguised as spiritual concern. That's when Pastor Jeremiah stood up from his chair behind the pulpit. I'd known Pastor Jeremiah Whitfield for 15 years, ever since my parents died and I'd moved back to Millbrook Valley as a broken 16-year-old. In all that time, I'd never seen him lose his composure during a service, never seen him deviate from his carefully prepared sermons, never seen him publicly address family drama or personal conflicts during worship time. Until yesterday. "Delilah," Pastor Jeremiah said quietly, his deep voice somehow reaching every corner of the sanctuary despite its gentle tone, "I think there's something the congregation should know before we continue." The authority in his voice was unmistakable. Delilah's confident smile began to falter as she realized that something was happening outside her carefully orchestrated script. Pastor Jeremiah walked slowly to the center of the altar, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. At 68 years old, he'd been leading Cornerstone Community Church for over 2 decades, and his presence commanded respect from even the most strong-willed members of his congregation. "You see," he continued, his eyes sweeping across the sanctuary before landing directly at Delilah, "3 weeks ago, I received a phone call that changed my understanding of this situation completely." My heart started racing. The conversation I'd had with Pastor Jeremiah after walking out of the Morrison family dinner had been private, confidential. I'd called him not to complain about my family, but to discuss something much more significant, something that I knew would eventually become public, but that I'd wanted him to hear from me first. "Sometimes," Pastor Jeremiah said, his voice growing stronger, "we make assumptions about people based on what we can see on the surface. We look at their clothes, their living situations, their apparent circumstances, and we think we understand their worth, their struggles, their contributions to our community." Delilah was still standing in front of the congregation, but her posture had changed. The confident authority she'd projected moments earlier was evaporating as she sensed that control of the narrative was slipping away from her. "But God sees the heart," Pastor Jeremiah continued, his tone taking on the resonance of a man about to deliver a profound truth. "God sees the sacrifices people make in secret. God sees the generosity that happens when no one is watching. God sees the love that flows from hearts that others have dismissed or underestimated." The congregation was hanging on every word, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but not knowing what. 3 weeks ago, Pastor Jeremiah announced, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a folded letter, "I received a phone call from someone in this congregation. Someone who had been watching the situation with the Morrison family and decided it was time for the truth to come to light." My face had gone pale. She was still standing in front of 300 people, but now she looked less like a queen holding court and more like a defendant waiting for a verdict. "The caller wanted me to know about a situation that had been kept confidential for over 3 years. A situation involving the largest single donation in Cornerstone Community Church's 70-year history." My breath caught in my throat. He was really going to do it. After 3 weeks of careful consideration and prayer, Pastor Jeremiah had decided that the truth was more important than preserving my anonymity. $10 million, and the words echoed off the vaulted ceiling like thunder.
$10 million donated anonymously to renovate our sanctuary, expand our food pantry, fund our youth programs, and establish a scholarship fund for underprivileged children in Millbrook Valley.
The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs. People turned to their neighbors with wide eyes, whispering questions and exclamations. $10 million was more money than most of them had ever imagined, let alone in connection with their small-town church. But Pastor Jeremiah wasn't finished. For 3 years, he continued, raising his hand for silence, I honored the donor's request for complete anonymity. The donation came through a law firm in Riverside, with instructions that no questions be asked and no recognition be given. The only requirement was that the money be used to serve our community's needs. Harold Morrison, who'd been sitting quietly beside his wife, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Jonathan and Priscilla were staring at Pastor Jeremiah with expressions of complete bewilderment. 3 years ago, Pastor Jeremiah said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet awe, someone in our congregation quietly solved problems that our church board had been struggling with for decades. The roof that needed replacement but that we couldn't afford. The food pantry that was running out of space and resources. The youth programs that we wanted to expand but didn't have funding for. The scholarship program we dreamed about but never thought possible. He unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, his eyes finding mine across the crowded sanctuary. All of it became possible because of one person's extraordinary generosity. One person who saw needs in our community and met them without asking for credit, recognition, or thanks. Delilah was swaying slightly on her feet. The color had completely drained from her face, and she looked like she was struggling to process what she was hearing. The caller 3 weeks ago explained that this anonymous donor had been publicly humiliated at a family gathering. Humiliated for sharing the truth about achievements that family members couldn't accept or believe. My hands were shaking. Everyone in the sanctuary was looking back and forth between Pastor Jeremiah and me, beginning to understand the connection, but not quite believing it yet. The caller said that this person had been characterized as delusional, as someone living in fantasy rather than reality. But the caller wanted me to know the truth, because watching someone be destroyed for their generosity had become unbearable. Pastor Jeremiah took a deep breath, preparing for the revelation that would change everything. The anonymous donor, who has quietly transformed our church and community for the past 3 years, he said, his voice carrying across the sanctuary with absolute clarity, is Evangeline Harper. The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted. People turned in my pews, craning their necks to stare at me. Voices rose in shock, confusion, disbelief. Mrs. Henderson actually gasped audibly. The Patterson family was staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted wings. But all of that faded into background noise as I watched Delilah's face cycle through emotions so rapidly that she looked like she was having some kind of breakdown. Shock, confusion, disbelief, then slowly the terrible realization that everything she just said about God's mistakes and lack of blessings had been directed at the person who'd been quietly funding her church for 3 years. Pastor Jeremiah wasn't finished. The woman who was just called God's mistake, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of reverence and righteous anger, is the reason this church has been able to expand its mission, serve more families, and provide opportunities for young people that never existed before. He held up the letter, which I now realized contained the documentation of my donations. Evangeline Harper has given more to this community in 3 years than most of us will contribute in our entire lifetimes. Not just money, but time, effort, and love. She's volunteered in our food bank, supported our programs, and asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to help others. Delilah finally found her voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. That's impossible. Pastor Jeremiah looked at her with something approaching pity. What's impossible, Delilah, is that you've spent years tearing down the person who's been building up everything you claim to care about. The truth was out. After 3 years of anonymity, 7 years of hiding my success, and a lifetime of accepting other people's diminished expectations, everyone in Millbrook Valley now knew exactly who Evangeline Harper really was.
The question was, what would happen next? What followed Pastor Jeremiah's revelation was unlike anything Cornerstone Community Church had ever experienced in its 70-year history. The first person to move was Mrs. Henderson, who stood up from her pew in the middle section and began walking toward me. Her steps were hesitant at first, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd just heard, but then she picked up speed until she was practically jogging down the aisle. "Evangeline," she said, reaching my back corner pew with tears streaming down her face. "Honey, I had no idea. All this time we all thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Her hands were shaking as she reached out to touch my arm, as if confirming that I was real, that this wasn't some elaborate dream or mistake. Behind her, I could see others beginning to stand. The Patterson family was on their feet, staring at me with expressions of complete bewilderment. Tom Patterson, who owned the hardware store below my apartment, was shaking his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile the women he'd seen carrying groceries upstairs with the mysterious benefactor who'd transformed their community.
But the most dramatic reaction was happening in the front row, where the Morrison family sat frozen in various stages of shock and horror. Harold Morrison looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His face was ashen, his hands gripping the pew in front of him so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. As a successful businessman, he understood numbers better than anyone else in that sanctuary, and the implications of what Pastor Jeremiah had just revealed were hitting him like a physical blow. $10 million. His niece, whom he dismissed as a financial failure, had quietly donated $10 million to their church. More money than Morrison Real Estate had generated in profit over the past 5 years combined. Priscilla was crying, but not tears of joy or celebration. These were tears of shame and regret, the kind that come from realizing you've been fundamentally wrong about something important for a very long time. Her hands were pressed to her mouth, and she kept shaking her head as if she could somehow undo years of dismissive comments and condescending assumptions. Jonathan had gone completely still, his lawyer's mind clearly racing through the implications of this revelation. Every family gathering where he'd questioned my judgment, every conversation where he'd suggested I needed to be more realistic about my capabilities, every moment when he'd treated me like someone who needed guidance rather than someone who was quietly outperforming everyone around her. But it was Delilah's reaction that would be talked about in Millbrook Valley for years to come. She was still standing at the front of the sanctuary, but now she looked like a statue that had begun to crumble. Her perfect posture had collapsed into something approaching a slouch. Her carefully composed expression had dissolved into something raw and vulnerable that I'd never seen before. "No," she whispered, but her voice carried in the absolute silence that had settled over the congregation. "That's not— she can't. I would have known." Pastor Jeremiah, who had been watching the unfolding reactions with the patient compassion of someone who'd spent decades shepherding people through difficult revelations, stepped closer to Delilah. "Would you have known, Delilah? Would you have been able to see Evangeline's generosity if she tried to share it with you? Or would you have found reasons to dismiss it, to explain it away, to make it fit the story you'd already decided to tell about her?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Delilah turned toward me, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. For the first time in my adult life, I was seeing her without her armor of confidence and control. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her own cruelty being reflected back at her. "No," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "That's not— she can't. I would have known." The congregation was listening to this exchange with the fascination of people watching a fundamental truth being born in real time. These were questions that many of them had been thinking but hadn't dared to voice. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on me. For 15 years, I'd occupied the back corner of this sanctuary as an invisible presence, someone people nodded to politely but rarely engaged with meaningfully. Now I was at the center of the most dramatic moment in the church's recent history. "I live simply because I choose to," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "The work I do, the money I earn, none of that changes who I am or what I need to be happy." I looked directly at Delilah, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. You assumed that because I didn't live like you, I couldn't achieve like you. You decided that because I made different choices, I must be making inferior choices. But you never once asked me about my life because you cared about the answer. You only asked so you could find new ways to fix what you'd already decided was broken. The truth of those words seemed to hit Delilah like a physical blow. She stumbled slightly, reaching out to steady herself against the nearest pew. "But why didn't you tell us?" Priscilla asked, her voice thick with tears. "Why did you let us think? Why did you let us say those things about you?" It was the question I'd been expecting, the one I'd been preparing to answer for 3 weeks. Because I hoped that eventually you'd see me for who I was, instead of who you thought I should be. I kept thinking that if I just worked hard enough, if I just achieved enough, if I just contributed enough, you'd finally look at me and see something other than disappointment. I paused, feeling the weight of years of accumulated hurt and hope. But I realized 3 weeks ago that you didn't want to see me differently. You needed me to be the failure so you could feel better about your own successes. My struggles made your achievements shine brighter. My failures made your choices seem smarter. You weren't invested in my success because my failure was too useful to you.
The silence that followed was profound. I could see people throughout the sanctuary processing not just the revelation about my donations, but the deeper truth about how families and communities sometimes invest in keeping people small. Harold Morrison finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Evangeline," he said, struggling to find words that could somehow bridge the gap between the assumptions he'd held for years and the reality he was now confronting. "I don't know how to... We owe you an apology that I don't know how to give." "You don't owe me anything," I said, and I meant it. "But you owe yourselves the truth about why you needed me to be less than I was." That's when Delilah finally broke completely. The woman who had spent years crafting my public image as the family disappointment, who had made a career out of diminishing my achievements and questioning my worth, collapsed into the front pew and began sobbing with the kind of raw, ugly crying that comes from realizing you've been fundamentally wrong about something that mattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered between sobs. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. What have I done? What have I been doing to you all these years?" The congregation watched in stunned silence as Millbrook Valley's most formidable woman fell apart in front of them, destroyed not by external attack, but by the weight of her own cruelty being revealed in the harsh light of truth. But for me, watching Delilah's breakdown, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication, not even satisfaction. I felt free. Free from their expectations, their limitations, their need to keep me small. Free from the story they'd written about my life, the role they'd assigned me in their family drama, the identity they'd insisted I accept. For the first time in my adult life, I was standing in that sanctuary as exactly who I was, with nothing hidden and nothing apologized for. The question now was, what would I do with that freedom? 6 months later, I'm sitting in my new office overlooking Riverside's downtown district, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The office isn't flashy, just a simple space with good natural light, comfortable furniture, and enough room for the 3 employees I've hired to help manage my expanding consulting practice and my newly established Harper Foundation. But the view reminds me every day that some transformations are worth waiting for. The Harper Foundation officially launched 4 months ago, funded with $25 million of my own money and dedicated to providing anonymous scholarships, community development grants, and emergency assistance to small towns throughout rural Pennsylvania. Our first initiative funded college scholarships for 37 students from families who couldn't afford higher education. Our second project renovated the community centers in 6 towns that had been struggling with aging infrastructure and limited resources. But the Foundation's most important work, I've discovered, isn't just about giving money away. It's about creating opportunities for people to be seen, valued, and supported in ways that help them become the fullest versions of themselves. Much like what Pastor Jeremiah did for me that Sunday morning 6 months ago. The changes in Millbrook Valley since that day have been remarkable, though not always in ways I expected.
Delilah Morrison has become, quite possibly, the most dramatically transformed person in our community's recent history. The woman who spent years crafting my public image as the family disappointment now spends her time crafting apologies, making amends, and working to understand how her need to control other people's narratives had damaged so many relationships over the years. She started therapy 2 weeks after the church incident, something that shocked everyone who knew her, since Delilah had always been vocally skeptical of paying strangers to listen to your problems. But watching her own cruelty reflected back at her in front of 300 people was apparently more effective than years of gentle suggestions from family and friends. The Delilah Morrison who emerges from those weekly therapy sessions is someone I'm still getting to know. She's quieter now, more thoughtful, quicker to listen and slower to judge. She's also become one of the Harper Foundation's most dedicated volunteers, working in our scholarship program with a humility and genuine care that surprises everyone who remembers the woman she used to be. I spent so many years needing other people to be less than they were so I could feel like more than I was, she told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings, a tradition that started when she asked if she could apologize to me privately without the drama of a public audience. I don't know how to undo that damage, but I'm trying to learn how to build people up instead of tearing them down. The transformation hasn't been easy for anyone in the Morrison family. Harold struggled for months with the realization that his business success, as impressive as it was locally, paled in comparison to what his niece had achieved quietly and without fanfare. But eventually his businessman's pragmatism kicked in, and he became one of my most trusted advisors for the Foundation's community development projects. Priscilla has channeled her guilt into action, using her medical training to establish a free health clinic funded by the Harper Foundation. She works there 2 days a week, providing basic medical care to families who can't afford traditional health care. It's become one of the most valued services in our community, and watching her pour her heart into helping others has been one of the most healing aspects of our family's reconstruction.
Jonathan, perhaps predictably, became the Foundation's legal counsel, handling all the paperwork and compliance issues that come with managing a large charitable organization. But more importantly, he's become someone I can talk to about the complexities of using wealth responsibly, the legal and ethical considerations of anonymous giving, and the strange psychology of being simultaneously powerful and invisible. The most unexpected change has been in my relationship with the broader Millbrook Valley community. For 15 years, I existed on the margins of this town's social fabric, present but not really seen, acknowledged but not particularly valued. The revelation about my donations could have easily shifted that dynamic to the opposite extreme, turning me into some kind of local celebrity or saint. Instead, something more interesting happened. People began seeing me as fully human for the first time, not as a failure who needed their pity, not as a mysterious benefactor who was somehow above normal human struggles, but as a complex person with both extraordinary capabilities and ordinary needs for connection, community, and belonging. Mrs. Henderson still slips me leftover baked goods after church, but now it's because she knows I love her cinnamon rolls, not because she thinks I need charity. Tom Patterson still offers me odd jobs, but now they're real projects where he values my input, not token work designed to help me get by. The teenagers who received Harper Foundation scholarships seek me out for advice about college and career planning. The families who benefited from our emergency assistance programs invite me to their graduation parties and wedding celebrations. The community centers we renovated host events where I'm welcomed not as a donor to be thanked, but as a neighbor to be included. This is what I'd been hoping for all those years without realizing it. Not recognition for my achievements, but acceptance for who I actually am. The consulting work continues to thrive, partly because the revelation of my identity has led to new clients who are intrigued by the idea of working with someone who understands both corporate strategy and small-town values. But more importantly, I no longer have to live two separate lives. The intellectual satisfaction of solving complex business problems and the personal fulfillment of contributing to my community are now part of the same integrated existence. Last month, I was featured on the cover of Pennsylvania Business Journal for an article about the consultant who revolutionized corporate strategy from small-town America.
The article discussed my unconventional career path, my unique approach to organizational psychology, and the ways that small-town perspectives can provide insights that urban consultants miss. But the quote they used as the headline wasn't about business strategy or consulting methodology. Success isn't about proving other people wrong, I'd told the interviewer. It's about becoming so secure in who you are that other people's opinions stop having the power to define your reality. That quote now hangs in my office, next to a photo from last Sunday's church service where I'm sitting in the front row for the first time in 15 years, surrounded by my family and community, finally occupying the space I'd always belonged in, but had never been invited to claim. The lesson I've learned through all of this isn't that hard work and perseverance always pay off, though they certainly can. It's not that success is the best revenge, though there's some satisfaction in proving doubters wrong. The real lesson is about the courage to be authentically yourself, even when the people around you are invested in keeping you small. For too many years, I allowed other people's fear, insecurity, and need for control to shape my understanding of my own worth. I accepted their limitations as my reality, their assumptions as my truth, their comfort zones as my boundaries. But authentic success, the kind that actually matters, that actually changes your life and the lives of others, requires refusing to let other people's vision of who you are become your vision of who you can be. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who most need you to stay exactly where you are. Sometimes breaking free from their expectations is the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for them. And sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as other people's biggest mistakes. Have you ever been underestimated by people who thought they knew your story? Have you ever had to choose between other people's comfort and your own growth? Tell me about it in the comments below. Because the truth is, we're all capable of more than the people around us can imagine. The question is, are we brave enough to prove it? Not just to them, but to ourselves. Remember, you don't need anyone's permission to become who you're meant to be. But you do need the courage to disappoint people who are more comfortable with your limitations than they are with your possibilities. Trust me, it's worth it.